pick up a photograph from September 9th, 1900. Look at it carefully. You see a city flattened to the waterline, wooden beams stacked like kindling for miles, and somewhere beneath that wreckage people, thousands of them, still unaccounted for. This was Galveston, Texas, the richest city on the Gulf Coast, the Wall Street of the Southwest. Population 37,789. And on a single Saturday night, somewhere between 6,000 and 12,000 of those people died. The number most Americans remember is about 8,000. But a final count was never completed. The dead were disposed of faster than they could be identified. Galveston in 1900 wasn't some backwater fishing town. It was the fourth largest city in Texas. It had the first electric lights in the state, the first telephone lines, the first medical college. Its deep water port handled nearly $292 million in exports. Cotton flowed through Galveston like blood through a heart. The Strand, its main business district, was lined with ornate buildings that rivaled anything in New York. Wealthy families built mansions along Broadway Avenue. This was a city that believed in its own future, and it sat on a sand barrier island. The highest point was 8 feet, 7 inches above sea level. That's it. You could practically stand on the beach and look across the entire island. There was no seawall, no flood barrier, nothing between the Gulf of Mexico and 37,000 sleeping people, but a row of sand dunes and some salt cedar trees. The U.S. Weather Bureau, just 10 years old at the time, had a station on the island. Isaac Cline ran it. He was smart, educated, a medical degree from the University of Arkansas and a doctorate from Texas Christian University. But in 1891, Cline wrote an article in the Galveston Daily News. He called the idea of a major hurricane hitting Galveston an absurd delusion. He said it would be impossible for any storm to create a wave that could seriously harm the city. Those are his words. Published. On the record, here's what makes this worse. Cuban meteorologists at the Colegio de Belen in Havana, they saw the storm coming. Father Gangite, one of their lead forecasters, tracked it, moving north over Cuba on September 4th. He predicted it would enter the Gulf, strengthen in the warm water, and head straight for the Texas coast. He was right about everything. But Willis Moore, the director of the USS Weather Bureau in Washington, had blocked Cuban weather telegrams. He'd ordered a ban on their forecasts being transmitted over telegraph lines. Eric Larson documents this in his book Isaac's Storm, citing Moore's own letters to the President of Western Union. Moore called the Cuban predictions hysterical, the work of backward people. So the most accurate hurricane forecast in the Western Hemisphere never reached Galveston. The standard explanation says the Weather Bureau was young and the science was limited. And honestly, that makes sense. It accounts for the lack of radar, the absence of ship-to-shore radio, the primitive instruments. But it doesn't account for Moore's decision to silence Cuban forecasters who had the answer. That part isn't a failure of science. That's institutional arrogance. On September 6th, Moore cabled Cline directly. His message read, "Not a hurricane. Turned north. Galveston will not be affected." By Friday morning, September 7th, things started to change. Washington ordered storm warning flags raised at the Galveston Weather Bureau office. Cline hoisted them atop the Levy building by 10:30 that morning, but the warnings didn't communicate the scale of what was coming. Most residents didn't believe this storm would be worse than the ones they'd lived through before. It had been many years since anything severe hit the island, and Galvestonians had grown used to occasional flooding they called overflows. The rising water was treated as excitement, not danger. The morning of September 8th dawned partly cloudy. Children played on homemade rafts in the flooded streets. Families walked to the beach to watch the waves. Nobody panicked, nobody ran. Cline's brother, Joseph, noticed the long swells breaking on the beach with a deep, low roar. The tide was higher than it should have been. He told Isaac a storm was coming. Isaac hesitated. By the time the full danger became clear, the bridges to the mainland had already washed out. 37,000 people were trapped on a sand island with nowhere to go. By 6:30 that evening, a storm wave swept ashore and raised the water 4 feet in seconds. The entire city went under, and that's the question that won't leave me alone. Ask yourself this: when the people who knew were silenced and the warnings that were given didn't match the danger, how many died because of weather, and how many died because of pride? Start with the bodies. On September 9th, the morning after the storm, survivors walked through streets piled with wreckage 20 feet high. Bodies were everywhere, floating in the bay, caught in the branches of salt cedar trees, pinned under collapsed houses. The Rosenberg Library in Galveston holds photographs from that morning. Catalogue images show barges loaded with corpses being hauled to the wharf. More than 700 bodies were taken out to sea and dumped on the second day, weighted down and dropped into the Gulf. The standard explanation for this has real merit. It was September in Texas. The heat was brutal. Disease was a genuine threat. Mass burial at sea was a practical decision under impossible conditions. But here's what happened next. The Gulf currents pushed the bodies back. They washed up on the beaches, bloated, unrecognizable. So the city changed course. They built funeral pyres, opened fires on the streets, on the beaches, wherever bodies were found. The fires burned day and night for weeks. Survivors reported the smell carried for miles, and the men who did the burning? 50 African-American men were forced into the work at gunpoint, according to multiple historical accounts. The authorities handed out free whiskey to keep the conscripted workers going. That detail sits in the record, and almost no one talks about it. The bodies were not burned before anyone tried to count them. They were burned after identification efforts became impossible, and the sheer number of dead overwhelmed everything the city could manage. Now go to the orphanage. St. Mary's Orphan Asylum stood at what is now 69th Street and Sewell Boulevard. 10 nuns, at least 90 children, ages 2 to 13. The Sisters of Charity of the Incarnate Word had cared for these kids since 1867, most of them orphaned by yellow fever. As the water rose on September 8th, the nuns brought all the children into the girls' dormitory. It was the newer building, the stronger one. Then each sister took a length of clothesline. She tied it around her own waist, and she tied 6 to 8 children to that line. Think about that for a moment. You're a nun in a collapsing building. You tie the children to yourself, so that if the water took them, at least they go together. Both buildings collapsed that evening. At least 90 children died. All 10 nuns died. 3 boys survived. William Murney, Frank Madera, and Albert Campbell. They ended up clinging to a tree that floated in the storm surge. They drifted for over a day before being rescued. When recovery crews found the nuns, the children were still tied to them. The Sisters of Charity of the Incarnate Word confirmed every detail. A Texas historical marker was placed at the site in 1994. The descendants of 2 of those 3 boys came to the dedication. Over on the Bolivar Peninsula, a train from Beaumont sat stranded near the ferry landing. The ferry couldn't dock. The train tried to back up, but rising water blocked the tracks. A small number of passengers left the train and made it to the Point Bolivar lighthouse, where local residents had already taken shelter. Most of those who stayed in the cars never made it out. The storm surge overran the tops of the train. Everyone inside the lighthouse survived. Same storm, same night, same coast. The difference was a few hundred yards and a decision made in the dark. Then there's Isaac Cline himself. His house collapsed during the storm. His pregnant wife, Cora, was killed. His brother Joseph saved 2 of Isaac's daughters. Isaac saved the third, 6-year-old Esther, while clinging to debris in the flood. He later wrote that his family rode out the worst of it on a raft made from wreckage of their own home. The man who told Galveston hurricanes couldn't hurt them lost everything in one. The death count. That's where the gap lives. The number you probably know is 8,000. But the National Park Service says estimated casualties for the entire island range from 10,000 to 12,000. The Texas State Historical Association says between 6,000 and 8,000 died in the city, with total island deaths reaching 10 to 12,000. The Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History says the death toll has never been established with certainty. These aren't fringe sources. These are the institutions we trust to keep the record straight, and they all say the same thing. The final number was never determined. That gap isn't small. It could represent thousands of people whose deaths were never individually documented. The funeral pyres burned without records. The barges dumped bodies without names. The Galveston Daily News and Houston Daily Post published long lists of the dead, but the Galveston and Texas History Center notes those lists contain only about 4,900 names. A complete list will never be known. The 1910 census counted 36,891 people in Galveston, down from 37,789. A Morrison and Formey Company survey found that roughly 2,000 survivors left and never came back. but the math still doesn't close cleanly. The study hasn't been done, not the way it could be. The Rosenberg Library's Galveston and Texas History Center holds the largest archive of 1900 storm materials in existence. Survivor letters, oral histories, photographs with original captions. The collection includes images labeled in handwriting from 1900. One reads, "Barge in Gulf, casting dead into the sea." Another reads, "Cremating the dead, the ashes of over 100 storm victims." These sit in a public archive at 2310 Sealy Avenue in Galveston. You can visit, you can request access, but very few researchers have used these materials to reconstruct an independent count of the dead. That connection between the photographic record, the survivor testimonies, and the actual mortality figures, it hasn't been examined the way it deserves. The archive doesn't just preserve the disaster, it preserves the limits of the record itself. Everything I've shown you so far is documented. You can look it up, you can verify every source I've named. What comes next is me thinking out loud. What if the 8,000 figure stuck not because it was accurate, but because it was the first number that felt manageable? A city trying to rebuild and attract investment might not want the world to think 12,000 people died there. That's speculation. The evidence is the consistent gap between the city's early reports and the later estimates from state and federal sources. What would disprove it is a documented count from 1900 that arrives at 8,000 through verified records. I haven't found one. What if Cuban forecasters' predictions, had they reached Galveston 12 hours earlier, would have triggered evacuations that saved thousands? The evidence is strong. When the next major hurricane hit in 1915, with a storm surge 3 inches higher than 1900, advance warnings meant only 8 people died in the city. 8, not 8,000. The difference was preparation and time. What would disprove this is evidence that residents wouldn't have evacuated even with a warning. And honestly, given that people were playing in the flooded streets that Saturday morning, that counter-argument has some weight. What if Willis Moore's decision to block Cuban forecasts was part of a broader pattern of post-war territorial control over scientific information? The Spanish-American War had ended just 2 years earlier. Cuba was still under American occupation. Moore assigned Colonel Dunwoody, a man who dismissed hurricane science as divination, to oversee Cuban weather operations. That's documented. What would disprove this framing is evidence that Moore's telegraph ban was standard diplomatic protocol. I haven't seen that evidence. These aren't answers, they're directions, and almost no one has walked down them yet. That photograph from September 9th is still there. You can see it at the Rosenberg Library. You can see it at the Library of Congress, which holds 90 stereograph prints from the aftermath. You can stand on Seawall Boulevard today, 17 feet above where the old beach used to be, and look out at the same gulf that swallowed a city in a single night. The seawall is there because of what happened. The raised streets are there because of what happened. You're walking on 16.3 million cubic yards of sand that was pumped in after 1900 to lift Galveston above the water that killed it. The dead don't have a number, they have a range, 6,000 to 12,000. And somewhere in that range, in that silence between the lowest count and the highest, there are people who were never named, never mourned, never even confirmed as gone. They burned on pyres in September heat, while a broken city tried to forget fast enough to survive. Some of them are still there, beneath the sand, beneath the streets. Construction crews in Galveston still occasionally uncover human remains from 1900. The grade-raising project buried everything: the wreckage, the foundations, the unmarked graves. 17 feet of sand poured over the memory of what happened. The system produced a number the record could not fully support because the dead were disposed of faster than they could be identified, and Galveston couldn't afford to stand still. So it buried the dead, raised the ground, built a wall, and kept going. But the question remains, pressed into the silence like a thumbprint in wet concrete. How many?